All right, and welcome back to Better Understanding the Bible. I'm your host, Dallas, joined again by Mercy. Hello, Mercy.
Oh,
And we're continuing our conversation today. We left off with the last one talking about the narrative between Genesis 1 and chapter 8. And today we're going to continue that, looking at to what did this transition then look like moving into Noah. So, yeah, Mercy's back to talk about this as we dig into these things. And hopefully she's got a lot to say with this because I think for most people, this is one of those conversations most people don't have that we need to. And realistically, how much it ties into the story of Adam and how important that is. And moving forward, we're going to get into all this stuff. So, like I said, Mercy, I hope you got lots to say because there's a lot to say on this topic. How's things been for you? You ready for this can of worms?
yeah, no, this is really good stuff. Thinking back on our childhood and going to Sunday school, VBS, these were epic stories that were told to us, right? And it was foundational, whether, if you're not really familiar with the Bible, but this, the story of Noah, right? And so to unpack this in the way that we are, I think is very important because it's giving a whole new background and the connection points from Adam to Noah. Because when it was told to us in church, it was always separate, like it's just out of nowhere. There is no connection point. And I think these videos are going to help people, like, oh my gosh, I see the pattern, I see the connection, what is really going on here, and what is covenant language. I think that is really key for people to really tap into. Like, the Bible is all about this covenant, the old covenant and the new covenant, and we're looking into it through that lens of a covenant system. And that will help people, like, okay, what is this language, right? Instead of reading it at face value, reading it literally, what is this covenant language talking about? And that's what we're going to unpack today.
And we're going to say covenant a lot in this conversation because that's literally what this whole transition is that we're going to be talking about. So we're going from 1 through 8, which tells the story of Adam from his building up to his falling down. Now that covenant is transferring. So we're actually doing a covenant transfer to a whole new head, a whole new ruler over the land, and how his story duplicates the story of Adam. So we're going to be saying covenant a lot because we're talking about the first covenantal transfer, which we remember talked in the last couple talks. Who wrote this and why? Moses wrote the Torah in order to inform Israel about where their covenant came from that they were inheriting.
Mhm.
This description is now the first transfer from that covenant head Adam to the next body. This becomes very important because out of the story of Noah comes Shem, and the history of Shem leads into Abraham, the promise, and the establishment of Israel. So, this transfer from Adam to Noah is the first transfer of the firstborn receiving the covenant. And we're going to see how far we get into this talk anyway, but then we're going to move also into that Noah's children, eventually leading up to Abraham in the next transfer. So,
Mhm.
we've been through this kind of hopefully, and you're familiar with the talks about Adam because now we're going to see how this stuff duplicates with Noah. Is there anything you wanted to throw in there, Mercy, before we get going?
Just to give a time reference, if you're looking for, okay, so how long did this happen? A lot of times when we read, we think, oh, it's just the next day, right? But you're talking about 10 generations from Adam to Noah, whatever that 10 generation means, right? And then you have another 10 generations from Noah to Abraham. And I think more people are familiar with, oh, the Abrahamic covenant, right? And they start right there and move forward. But we want to show people today that no, the covenant, is stemming all the way back to Noah, to Adam, and that whole continuation.
And on purpose. It's not just a story. Genesis is the historical prologue, the history of God's interactions with the people that led to the coming of Israel and their inclusion into it. So, yeah, we are doing this on purpose that way. Uh, And I think that's good. maybe we should get into the text and go from there, because
Sure.
what we did last time, if you haven't seen going through the narrative of Genesis 1 to Genesis 8, I would highly recommend going through that, because we're going to now continue on as if you know this. So just a quick refresh so we can pick up here in Genesis 9. Genesis 1 is the creating of the head of the land of Mesopotamia, given dominion to rule. Genesis 2 is his descendants and the body under that headship. And those people got to rule over the land of Mesopotamia. When we get to Genesis 3, we get to hear the story and the times of those people. And unfortunately, in Genesis 3, the headship falters, they fail, they incorporate other things that they were not supposed to, and they break the covenant agreement. Genesis 4, we pick up with the descendants of those people, and they likewise become murderers and polygamists, and they also break the covenant. And so we see in Genesis 1 the establishment of the head, Genesis 2 the establishment of the body, of the rulership over the land of Mesopotamia. Genesis 3 is the head's fall, Genesis 4 is the body's fall. So the creation of Adam, the corporate body of Adam, and the fall of them. Genesis 5, we need to point out in this talk a little bit more, because this jumps in, and now we have a genealogy from Adam to Noah. And that's talking about this firstborn list. So from Adam to Seth, who replaced Cain, who replaced Abel as the next born in line, and then his next firstborn. That leads all the way up to Noah, the next firstborn, which then we read in Genesis 6, which we can liken to the book of Revelation, to the people of Eden. This is where God comes and announces there's going to be a judgment. He tells them the time period of 120 years, just like when Jesus appeared, he said it'll be 40 years. And so we have that. And in Genesis 6 specifically, God calls out Noah and says, you will be the next covenant man. I'm going to destroy this whole place. So then Genesis 7 becomes AD 70 of the time of Israel, in which, he comes in and wipes the whole place out in a flood language situation. And so Genesis 1, creation head, Genesis 2, creation body, Genesis 3, fall of the head, Genesis 4, fall of the body, Genesis 5, the coming of the new head, Genesis 6, the declaration of judgment and destruction, Genesis 7, the actual destruction. And that brought us to Genesis 8, which was the beginning of the new man in Noah. And that's where we're going to pick up, is in Genesis 9. Noah came off the boat, landed on the dry, and now his people got the blessing and the promises of God. And that's what we're going to take up in Genesis 9, because what we're going to find here is now we have a new Adam. So, it just cut out for a second. There we go. Everything looks good. All right. So here we have the beginning of a new Adam. That was one cycle from Genesis 1 to 8, from the kingdom beginning to the kingdom fall to the kingdom ending. So what we're going to see here now is the exact same thing going on, where it's just with Noah and Noah's descendants and their rule over the land. So before we make that transition, do you think we missed anything in there? Is that a good wrap up?
Yes. Can I just ask you a quick question? Could we say that now that we are having a new headship, with Noah, like, how do we express or explain that this is a new covenant, but it's still the same covenant? You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we're seeing here, and that's what's so important about Genesis 5, is the genealogy, because we're looking at the firstborn sons. So the covenant that Adam engaged into, this is passed down through that firstborn lineage. So the kingdom given to him, and what kingdom are we referring to? Well, that's Genesis day 6, when God gave them dominion over the earth. Well, that kingdom, that dominion and rule passed from Adam down to Noah. So this is an inheritance transfer. And when we get into Genesis 9, and it's a great question to lead up to, we're going to see not only is this just a lineage kingdom, but the covenant itself is restated, but with some different contingencies. So it's the same covenant, but it gets amended.
Correct. I think that's very important to note. Thank you for that.
Perfect. And it's a great question, because we see the exact same thing come with Jesus, who, when God sets up and establishes this covenant with Moses, Jesus comes and amends their covenant and brings rest to them as well. So the parallels are very striking. So good foreshadowing.
Mhm.
All right, so let's get into Genesis 9, because what we're going to do is find out, and the good question leading up to this is this transfer of covenant. What kind of covenant was transferred? Because in Genesis 6, God says, I will establish my covenant with you. And here in Genesis 9, we see that happening. And what does it say? Well, in Genesis 9, we look at 9:1. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Well, that's actually quoting Genesis 1.
Yeah.
I'm just going to flip down to, I think it's verse 28.
The
And
dominion state, right? That's
yeah,
the state.
exactly. And what does it say? It says, and God blessed them. So this is Genesis 1:28 saying, and God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the heaven, and over everything that moves on the earth. And behold, I give you every plant yielding seed that will be food for you. Well, let's go back to Genesis 9. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon the beast, upon every bird of the heavens, and upon everything that creeps on the ground, and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Well, that's a weird statement. The fear and the dread of you shall be upon them, and into your hand they are delivered. Well, if we go into Genesis chapter 2, we get a very good example of what this is actually talking about, as the exact same statements are going to be said, but in updated terms, so in more natural terms. And so, what do we read in Deuteronomy 2? Now, the people of Israel are being led out of the wilderness, and they're going to be led, and they're taking the land. They're finally getting dominion, and they're no longer wandering. And in Deuteronomy 2, verse 24 and 25, it reads and says, rise, take your journey and cross over the river Arnon. Look, I have given into your hand Sihon the Amorite, the king of Heshbon, and his land. Begin to possess it and engage in battle with him. This day I will put the dread and the fear of you upon the nations under the whole heaven, and they shall hear the report of you and shall tremble and be in anguish because of you. Well, what does it say in Genesis 9? It says, and the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, the bird of the heavens, and all the fish of the sea, everything that's under heaven. Literally the exact same thing given to Israel, who what? Went out and had dominion over the nations of the land.
And you're reading
So
from Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 24 to 25.
that's correct. But
Right.
if you're at home and you have opportunity, go and read the entire chapter of Deuteronomy 2, because they're ordered, don't take from these people, take from these people. When you go in, these people will be afraid, but they're relatives. So don't take anything from them. I won't give you any of their land. But then when it gets down to here, he's like, now these people, go and take from them. So they're given specific place where they get their promised land, which we're interestingly enough going to be moving into quite as the next topic here. So as we keep reading verse 2, now we understand more clearly verse 1, 9:1, God bless them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear or the dread shall be upon you, well, shall be upon the nations that surround you. They were given dominion over them. Into your hands they are delivered. They were given dominion over them. Verse 3, and every moving thing that lives on the earth shall be food for you, as I gave you the green plants. This is the exact same day 6 mandate with an alteration. So this is a new covenant under the same old one. The old one's still here, exactly the same way, with an amendment. And we're going to get into a couple more of these amendments as well. So, but before we move on, is there anything else in there that jumps out at you that you think needs to be addressed? We hit the duplication of the covenant of Adam. handed over is definitely talking about the fruitful and multiply, the dominion over all that creeps on the earth, and it even the provision for the peoples are outlined yet again, but actually widened.
Hmm. Well, I think the dominion mandate for Genesis 1:28, I was taught that that was given only one time. And they always go back to that one verse and really take it out of context to justify a lot of things that, Christianity has done throughout the, millennia. Um, and what's so funny is like as I'm going through this with you and reading through it, it's like, oh my gosh, we have the same mandate in Genesis 9. We see the same mandate in Deuteronomy chapter 2, right? This is where I think you do a beautiful job in what connecting the biblical language and seeing how is this being used again and again. And in your very early videos, you're talking about how does scripture interpret scripture. It's funny, like in Bible school and seminary, we say that all the time, but they do a really poor job in connecting this whole like genre and narrative of what's really happening holistically in the Bible. So it's not just in Genesis 1:28, this dominion mandate, it's a continuation. And like I said before, it's always like a fractal and then builds a little bit more as you get closer to the time frame of Israel, then builds a little bit more because why? The focus is on Israel. But they have to establish legitimacy with Adam because, like you said, it's an inheritance and it's a sonship, and this is how the kingdom is being transferred. When we can grasp this, then we're understanding, oh, when Jesus comes on the scene and he says, oh, the kingdom is here, he's doing the exact same thing as Noah, as Adam, right? And now we're being able to, piece these things together. So I think that's great. You gave 3 texts right there that is scripture, interpret scripture.
And we need to see that pattern because obviously the pattern's in there. Because if we were just looking at the Torah, Moses made it so that we should see that pattern. And so let's see how much more deep this goes because we need to understand this is an intent. And I like how you brought up Jesus. I would just like to point out because those same patterns then we see are repeated with Jesus.
Mhm.
Isn't it interesting how Jesus was the seed of Abraham who was planted in the earth and who was raised on the third day, the true vine producing fruit? That's day 3 of Genesis 1. So that language never goes away, and we need to see why. And what does Jesus do? It
Mention real here, like John 15, that was huge when Jesus talking about the vineyard. I am the vine, you are the branches, you can't do anything with that. What is he talking about in this vineyard, which you're going to go into shortly here about Noah being placed in a vineyard? It's that same narrative. It's just we just haven't been able to see it under this Christian theology that is so like one-sided, right? Without knowing like the full scripture, interpret scripture. So Jesus is actually taught, the whole chapter is talking about that vineyard. And there's been church denominations that have been named after that, the vineyard, right? It's so critical and important without even understanding the basis of, oh my gosh, this is the basis of Genesis.
and when we take a look at how they established Jesus, how did they do it? Well, Luke does it by quoting Genesis 5's genealogy and saying that Jesus is the firstborn son.
Mhm.
Well, when we take a look at Exodus, what do we see? God sends Moses into Pharaoh to say what? Exodus 4:22,
Yeah.
Israel's my firstborn son. Let them come out and worship me.
Mhm.
Was Jesus, the firstborn son, saying to Israel, let my children come out and worship God? It's the exact same imagery. And where do they get that from? They get it from Noah coming out of Adam, coming out of Eden. And so as we continue in here, I think we can transition. We're good, right?
Yep.
Okay, so now what we're going to do is so we have this. Okay, the covenant was taken away from Adam and given to Noah. To what? Produce the fruit thereof. Again, duplicating Jesus, who said, the kingdom will be taken away from you, Israel, and given to the kingdom, producing the fruit thereof. And that's
Mhm.
exactly what we just saw. No doubt the exact same kingdom came, but with some alterations. hopefully for the best. So let's take a look at that as we go down. We're going to, and we are slightly familiar, so I'm just going to hit these quickly. We're not going to spend time on it. As we see right after that in verse 8, then Noah said to his sons, behold, I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds and the livestock, the beast, and as many that came out of the ark, it is for every beast of the earth. So here, all the land of Mesopotamia are brought back under the exact same order Adam did, with man raised up into the heavens, ruling over the land and the sea. And that's the exact same thing we're seeing displayed here. Is this is the covenant of the land and region of Mesopotamia, with a head ruling them. And what does it say in verse 11? I will establish my covenant with you that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. Now, this we do get, we see this fulfilled in the coming judgment against Babel, when God disperses them instead of coming in with a flood at their folly. So we actually see this play itself out. So again, this is, all intents and purposes, it was a covenant change that was for the best of the human. So there was mercy put into this.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't really want to go too much into that. I'll just throw the one thing out that I think is interesting is we do read in 16 when it says the bow is in the clouds, and I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all the creatures of the world. Now, what's neat about that is the bow is symbolizing, this is war, right? We're talking, this is a war bow. God just set the flood to destroy everything. And in Revelation, he sends Jesus riding on a horse with a bow in his hand. You see, it's a different covenant because he's allowed to bring his bow out, and he comes with a flood. That's what Daniel says, the end will be with a flood. So we see that this covenant promise, this everlasting covenant, Jesus comes with the bow in his hand. Well, here he's saying the bow will remind him he'll never do this again. Well, which is it? Which covenant's being broken? Is Jesus breaking the covenant, or is God? So it's just some fun stuff for you guys to think about on that one. We'll get into that one day. That's a whole conversation in itself. But that's neat, right? So here we have this covenant, and it is slightly changed. It went from Adam, it went to Noah, still includes the entire region with a head of Noah over all the other the beasts of the field. But with this, there's a provision of judgment. So this one's a little bit different, but it's this continuation of Adam. Now, when we go into verse 20, we get into more of these details, and these are very important details. So now in verse 20, so to summarize, we have our new Adam, and he's about to get a new job. Or is it the same job? And that's what we find in verse 20. Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. Now, what's very interesting about that is Noah began to be a man of the soil. Well, when we jump into Genesis 2, well, we get a description of Adam in verse 15 that says, and the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it, keep it, and cultivate it. Well, what did we just read about Noah? Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. That's very interesting when we also consider Genesis 4:1, where we're talking about Adam's firstborn. And what do we see in Genesis 4? And now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And he is described in verse 2 as, and Cain is a worker of the soil. That's interesting. Adam's a worker of the soil, a tiller of the ground. Cain is a tiller of the ground, a worker of the soil. The firstborn, well, who was Adam? According to Luke, genealogy in chapter 3, Adam is the firstborn son of God. So Adam, the firstborn son of a God, he gets the kingdom. He becomes the tiller of the ground, the worker of the soil, who has a firstborn son, who also becomes a tiller and a worker of the soil. And when we find out in Genesis 5, Noah is the next in line to inherit the kingdom. And in verse 9:20, what does he become? A worker of the soil. This is the transfer of Adam's kingdom to the next inheritance, who is supposed to work the vineyard. What was the what was the curse? The land won't produce fruit,
Mm-hmm.
right? They became fruitless. Well, Noah is put in charge of a vineyard to produce fruit. The kingdom was taken away from you because it wasn't producing fruit, given to Noah so that you'd be the head of a new vineyard to produce fruit. So it's very interesting how the exact same descriptor, we have a new Adam in the land. What Cain was supposed to inherit, he didn't. Noah did.
Mm-hmm.
So we have the new tiller of the ground. Does that make sense? Or does that seem like a stretch at all?
No, it flows directly. It's just people have not been able to see the connections. And what's really interesting is like the new covenant or the new covenant head, it's the same covenant, but there's these little nuances that are different, as if for that generation or that time, God wanted to do something different specific for that time, right? So it's the same thing of when we talk about Jesus and that new covenant, that God wanted to do something new and different at that time. Now, when we talk about, how God gave this promise to Noah and that he wasn't going to destroy it, right? The kingdom of Eden that he destroyed under the flood, under the war. You see that, okay, in the Tower of Babel, like you were saying, they were just scattered and exiled. We see that a lot with when we look at Israel, the house of Israel, the house of Judah, and when they went into the Assyrian captivity and the Babylonian captivity, how they were sent out and scattered, but then they returned back. Now, when we're talking about Genesis 11, talking about the Tower of Babel, like I never imagined in my head that that had any connection to the promise that God had given to Noah. Like we think of these stories separate, like in Bible school or in like VBS as kids and stuff. These stories are told like in their own individual sets, and there's no like connection. I know I continue to repeat this on this video, but I think it's really important because as we're learning this and how Genesis is being portrayed, I think that's really important to see those connections. I never thought in my mind like, oh my gosh, God did keep that covenant promise to Noah, because he didn't burn down the Tower of Babel. He just scattered them. I never would have put that together, because we're told, oh no, that rainbow is the 7-color rainbow. It's not a bow of war. And this is about the whole planet and the whole, that God will never, never destroy it, which I never understood for the futurists. Because if you believe that promise, then how do you believe that at the end, God's going to destroy everything? It never made sense to me. You say one thing at the one corner of your mouth, that this rainbow is promising that God will never destroy the earth, but then at the other corner of your mouth, the futurists are saying, oh no, God's going to destroy the earth and it's going to be bad because it's going to be nuclear and everything. You know what I mean? Like all of these things pop up.
Well, we see other patterns too, like with the exile. We see that with Cain being exiled out, but who came back onto the boat? It was the lost beasts out in the. So we see that with Jesus. It was the exiles who were brought back in. So in that same kind of motif, that same look at it, and there's a lot of other stuff that we have to consider, but unfortunately, as we keep going at this, we're going to get too gone. But there is something to be said here about that everlasting. Even Gary DeMar points out there's very many things, and we got to start looking at the covenants as being transactional, in that they don't transition from one group to another. In that once they're fulfilled, they play their role. They do have finishes. So, for example, the priesthood under the Mosaic system was promised forever. Well, we're glad it ended if we on this side of the coin want to learn anything from it. And so it even depends on your eschatology. Some people believe they're literally benefiting from those very like things coming to an end.
Mm.
So we've got to take a look and say, are these what are these words pertaining to? And we'll get into a whole video of it. I just want to throw that out there because Well, we're not the crazy ones who also are just standing around on their own. Other people have realized the context of everlasting and eternal, the promise of the promised land given to Israel. This is an eternal promise given to Israel forever. Well, that came to an end. So again, there's a lot of promises that are everlasting and eternal that even scholars like Gary DeMar have clearly pointed out, and we've got to keep this into context. So a little bit of a slippery subject, and I don't want to turn this whole conversation into it. But if that's a concern that you would have in this language, especially considering we are going through this section and it does pop up, I would definitely say do a Bible study where you take that word, go and look at it, and find out how many of the eternal promises you're glad have come to an end.
Because
So,
fulfilled.
yes.
Yes.
Or that time period has moved on. A new covenant people came to replace those old covenant people, just like here we see Noah replacing the old covenant people. Well, why didn't the old covenant people get the everlasting no flood promise? Because God does something different with these people. And we've got to understand that there's going to come another people, namely after this Israel, which God's going to do something else with. He even says in one of I can't remember which off the top of my head, but this is a covenant I've never made even all the way with your forefathers, in the sense of this is another amended version of the Adam covenant. So just a fun study. Again, I'll throw that out at you. You can Google Gary DeMar. It's in one of his books. I'm sure there's other papers that he's written on it, but he's not the only person. We've just got to, again, come to grips and terms with these hard things that we, today, when we use the word forever, we are not using it in the context they used it in, and we just bridge that gap a little bit. So there, that's all the time I want to devote to that. Is okay, Mercy? We kind of
Fun.
that's a cat. Yeah, it's a can of worms, but it's got to be hit. So anyway, moving on, just a quick refresher then. Genesis 8, we have now seen. So Genesis 1 through 7, Eden has come, Adam's reign, they ruled, they fell, they were judged. The kingdom now was taken away from them, transferred over to Noah, the next in line through inheritance. So this is hereditary. Him and his descendants gained the right to rule over all those who filled the earth from him. And so here we have, again, the same covenant system, a head with a body ruling over all the beasts and the fish, the same exact system as Adam. He gets made into a man of the soil and is given a vineyard. So now we're catching up to Genesis chapter 2 in the sense that everything is established. We could almost say here that Noah is naked and unashamed before God. There's no blemish. There's no sin. They are the restored Edenic church now in the Noah system. Does that make sense? Or
Yeah, no, that's
okay,
good.
perfect. So now we're coming upon the life and the times. We're moving into like a Genesis 3 here. We're moving into the life and times of Noah. So now that Noah had become a man of the soil and he planted a vineyard, in verse 21, he drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. So if the vineyard here again is referring to the garden, which is the land, the region of Mesopotamia, the land in which I just kind of got all staggered there. Is everything good?
Yep.
Okay, good. All right, I'll caught up. All right, so if we're reading Noah became a man of the soil and planted a vineyard, as likened to Adam being given dominion to rule over the land, this is talking about keeping the land fruitful, keeping it good and healthy so that many nations could flourish under them. Well, when we take a read of that, then that means in 21, he drank the wine, became drunk, and covered in his tent. The tent is really a tabernacle reference. And so we're getting that same imagery here of the vineyard, the tabernacle, the temple. And it's very important for us to point out here, and I just want to make sure that I have the right reference, which I do believe is Leviticus 1:10. Yeah, so verse 1:10, so Leviticus 1, what? Leviticus 10, rather, sorry, but Leviticus 10, verse I'll just start at 7, and then we'll just read it and you'll see where it comes in. So, and do not go outside the entrance of the tent of meeting, lest you die, for the anointing oil of the Lord is upon you. And they did according to the words of Moses. Verse 8, and the Lord spoke to Aaron, saying, drink no wine or strong drink, you or your sons with you, when you go into the tent, lest you die. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations. Well, this is coming from where? Leviticus. This is the same law that Moses said comes from Adam. This is the same law then that Noah inherited. And what does it say? It says, when you come into the tent, you can't do it drinking. And what do we find with Noah? Well, he's coming into what? The tent drinking. And so what is he? Well, he's a man of the soil. He's the firstborn. He's the high priest of the new vineyard. And he got caught being drunk in the tent. So he's dead. He died. He was cursed. We'll get into that in a little bit, but we can see that that's that legal language that is being taken from the law that Moses wrote in Leviticus, and that exact same phrasing is now being used to describe Noah. So this is the same author doing this jump. This isn't, hey, check it out, this kind of sounds the same. This is the same author using the same words, using the same scenario of as a priest going into the tent of the tabernacle, the tent of the vineyard, to perform his priestly duties, and he's not allowed to drink. So that's a pretty straightforward example there. And then I do believe,
If I can mention just for the audience, when you look up the word cultivate or to work the soil or the tiller of the ground, this is a very high, sophisticated Hebrew word, and it's always in connection to a priesthood, meaning serving in the temple. So, what you're seeing here in covenant language is a temple worship scenario. Adam, Noah being like a high priest, Cain was as well, because Cain was a tiller of the ground. So when we're looking at these words and going deeper into the Hebrew context, this is what we're seeing, that we're entering into like a temple worship system. So it's not going out and, just farming the land, rows and rows of like carrots or corn or whatever. That's not what's happening here. And so I think people can get confused when they're not understanding the meaning of these words and what we call covenant language, and that is the context. And remember, Hebrew is a very concrete set of words and ideas, and so they use concrete, very tactile words to then express a very abstract concept. So you're seeing like this word picture all the time. And so when we don't know that and we read things just at face value, then we just take it literally like, oh, they were just farmers, just doing the land. No, they were actually high priests. It was a whole temple system. And so for Noah here to be drunk, this is a big failure on his part.
and we see that imagery all the way from Genesis 1 when Adam is given dominion over the earth. He's not being given dominion over pets. This isn't about who can own the largest lion. This is about him ruling and reigning over the people of the land. Well, that title, the way it's described, is a worker of a garden, and that's the temple worker. Then we see his firstborn son, who was supposed to continue in his father's footsteps, get described the same way. And now here we have the third, we have Noah being a man of the soil who's given a vineyard. And unfortunately, he also goes and breaks the statutes that are written later by the same author. So it's when we take a look at that, all of a sudden we see this narrative coming out that's much more, and we've got to keep this in mind, that's national. The covenant is national. It's not really as individual as we would like to make it. This was about how is the nation of Israel coming to be the next dominion. This was how Adam was a nation with dominion. This was how Noah was a nation with a dominion. This isn't about how individuals chose how to behave.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got to understand these are grandiose pictures being displayed in the tiniest of ways. And so when we take a look at that, that's why we're reading that Noah began to be a man of the soil and he planted a vineyard, is we're now repeating this procession. And what was also repeated, just as Adam broke the covenant, so did Noah. And Noah drank of the wine and became drunk and laid uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Now, this again is another one of these phrases that we're going to have to become familiar with. So when we read, saw the nakedness of his father, well, we're going to go to, again, Leviticus, but this time chapter 18. And we just got to get familiar with this language and how they spoke, because here in Genesis, they're being very polite. And here we're going to see them be much more graphic in the way they want to describe what's going on. So Leviticus 18:1. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the people of Israel and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You shall not do as they did in the land of Egypt, where you lived, and you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan, to which I'm bringing you, the land of Canaan. Well, what did we just read in Genesis 9? Well, it says, Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father. Very interesting. Why Canaan? Well, you shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt, where you live. You shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan, to which I'm bringing you. And what is it that they shall not do? Verse 6. None of you shall approach any one of his close relatives to uncover nakedness. I am the Lord. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father, which is the nakedness of your mother. So if I'm married to a woman, obviously, that means my nakedness is my wife. So my nakedness is not me. My nakedness is my wife. As we continue, it says in verse 7, you shall not uncover the nakedness of your father, which is the nakedness of your mother. She is your mother, and you shall not uncover her nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife, for it is your father's nakedness. So this is actually a marriage issue. No, verse 9, you shall not uncover the nakedness of your sister, your father's daughter. This is how. Nope. Am I cut off there for a second? Let's see
Yeah,
if I, okay.
yeah, just repeat
This,
that.
yeah, okay. So now this isn't just some marriage thing. This is how they described one person and a relation to another. So a husband, his nakedness is actually describing his wife. And then just as we see here, your sister's nakedness is actually revealing the nakedness of your father's daughter. So there's these connections, right? And it's telling us for what purpose? You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father, which is the nakedness of your mother. And then we go down. Let's see, where is this? Verse 17, you shall not uncover the nakedness of a woman and of her daughter, and you shall not take her son's daughter or her daughter's daughter to uncover her nakedness. They are relatives. It is depravity.
Mm-hmm.
You shall not take a woman as a rival wife to her sister, uncovering her nakedness while your sister is still alive. So this is all about marriage and consummation of marriage. Sex. This is all about that. You shall not approach, verse 19, a woman to uncover her nakedness while she is in her menstrual. You can't, this is clearly talking about sex. That's all it is. We can't get around this. Why is this a big deal? because it even gets into you shall not have sex with animals. It's a perversion. Verse 24. Do not make yourselves unclean by any of these things, for by all these things the nations for by all these the nations I'm driving out before you have become unclean. So these acts demote you in covenant standing from being clean and acceptable to being unclean and unacceptable. Verse 25, and the land became unclean, so that I punished its iniquity, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. But you shall keep my statutes and my rules, and do none of these abominations, either the native or the stranger who lives among you. For the people of the land who were before you did all these abominations, so that the land became unclean. Lest the land vomits you out when you make it unclean, as it vomited out the nation that was before you. For everyone who does any of these abominations, the persons who do them shall be cut off from among their people. So keep my charge, never to practice any of these abominable customs that were practiced before you, and never to make yourselves unclean by them. And this is literally what we heard took place during Noah's time period of being drunk in the tent. Now, there's also one more reference that we can make to this, which is in Leviticus chapter 20, as we get a little bit more in depth here again. Verse 10. If a man commits adultery with the wife of his neighbor, is this? Oh, yeah, this is where okay, yeah, that's right. So if you want to, on your own time, because we don't want to reread it, if you go into Leviticus 20 and read this section, we get a repeating again of this same ordinance because it's so important that they, in 2 chapters, feel the need to go into the details of making sure that you understand all this. And he goes on to say that even if you do this and you're going to end up sacrificing your children to Molech and all these others. So it's talking about keeping yourself clean. And then it goes on to say, for anyone who curses his father and mother put to death. And it's all adding up to what? The same problem with if a man lies, and it says more plainly, if a man lies, verse 11, if a man lies with his father's wife, he has uncovered his father's nakedness. Both of them shall be surely put to death. So go through the whole thing, though. Read that whole thing because it goes right into that details again, but again says it point blank clearly. Now, this is a big deal as we're going to combine this into Deuteronomy 23 because the question then becomes, what is a result of this? One, they're going to be kicked off the land. They're going to be exiled. That's what we just read. But now in Deuteronomy, we also see in Deuteronomy 23, verse 2, no one born of a forbidden union may enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of his descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord. No Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. So here we have again, what does it say? It said, if you are caught doing these things, you will be cut off from the peoples. Even up to the 10th generation, you will not be allowed back into the presence of God. Why is that a big deal? Well, we just finished reading in Genesis 9, verse 22, and Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father. Ham, because Noah was drunk and passed out, Ham came in and raped his mother. And we don't want to read it that way, but that's what it says. And what happens? Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on their shoulders, and walked backwards and covered the nakedness of their father. So here we have a picture of a covering. Well, this is very interesting. So here we have the fall of Adam or the fall of Noah. And then what do we get? What does he do when he wakes up? Verse 24, when Noah woke from his wine, he knew what his youngest had done to him. So as soon as he wakes up and he finds out that, Ham has gone and raped his wife, cursed be Canaan. Noah blasphemed, broke the covenant, however you want to say it, by entering into the tent drunk. As a result of breaking that covenant stipulation, the curse came back into his family. This curse led to Ham breaking the system. He slept with his father's wife. And then what happened? The curse came back in. And then what happened? Just like Adam went and they had an issue with his wife. And as a result of an issue with his wife, the curse came in. Then what did God do? He gave them a covering. And what do we have here? An issue with the new Adam, an issue with his wife, and they gave him a new covering. We can't skip over the similarities. They're exactly the same things. And then what does it say? And when Noah woke from his wine, he cursed him and he said, and you shall be a servant of servants to his brothers. Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. Well, what was the promised land? It was Canaan. And who inherited it? Shem. How? Shem gave birth to the genealogy that led to Abraham, who received the promise of the covenant, which was realized in Israel, who were led to Canaan, and they took over the land of Canaan to rule all the region of Mesopotamia from. It was their garden. It was their tabernacle placed on their special land in which they were put head over to rule all the region so that it would be fruitful. So they were ruling all the land of Mesopotamia from their garden. And that's why, because here in Genesis, Noah's wife was raped by Ham, whose children Canaan had their land promised to the head, Shem. How do we know Shem's the head? Very interesting statement. Cursed be Canaan. Verse 25, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers. Verse 26, blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. So Canaan is given to Shem, God of Shem. This is the same thing as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Jesus. That meant who you needed to call upon in order for your prayer to be heard by God. So God went from Noah and set up shop with Shem. And what happened to Japheth? Well, may God enlarge Japheth and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan, the cursed one, be his servant. So Shem took in Japheth and they ruled over the land of Canaan. Well, where did Ham go? According to the law, Ham was cursed and kicked out. He's no longer part of the inheritance. He was exiled. So this entire scenario follows all the law written down by Moses, which is interesting considering that Moses wrote down this interaction. So it would be safe to say he intended that. So before we go any further with that, we just finished, and then it goes into the death of Noah. We have a picture here of Noah became a man of the soil, ruling and reigning over the vineyard. He became drunk and blasphemed the temple. As a result, Ham came in and took advantage of his wife. And then we have a covering needed, a curse being laid out. And we have a what? A duplication of Adam. Adam fell, the head fell, Noah fell drunk. The body fell, people became corrupted. How? Through the sons. Exact same thing. Now the sons come, the land becomes corrupted. Same issue. And their sons, as we will read, unfortunately not in this video, but in the next one, in Genesis chapter 10, the sons of Ham become a very recognizable force in the land of Mesopotamia, being the fathers of such people as Egypt and Babylon. So we'll get into that interesting stuff, right? The cursed one becomes the pain and the thorn of the covenant Shem for the rest of the story. We got to understand why these things were put together, because in my opinion, without understanding this, we won't even understand why Israel's on Canaan.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So I said a lot there, and we're going through a lot of stuff, and I'm sure you had a million thoughts, Mercy, and it just, floor is yours.
No, that needs to be said. I taught this, I think like 3 years ago at my church, and it was very eye opening, right? The idioms that they use because you're trying to save face. A lot of the Eastern culture is to save face, so you wouldn't say it out publicly, like, yeah, Ham raped his mother. It would be like covering, right? Because Noah was the covering of his wife, so therefore his property really that he did not take care of. So therefore you see here in this scenario, these boys, the law of inheritance, the firstborn sons, and they're trying to usurp their birthright positions. Because not only does this happen with Ham, but later on we see that Reuben does this with one of Jacob's handmaidens, and he loses that birthright. That's why Reuben, you don't have a tribe like Joseph. Joseph was the birthright leader, right? And so Reuben loses that, goes down to Levi and Simeon, but then they did something when they went into the city and they like massacred the whole town. So they lost that birthright, and it finally went to Judah. And that's why we had the house of Judea and the house of Judah. So what you're seeing is these sons that are vying for, competing against these firstborn sons or the secondborn sons, and they're trying to get that dominion or that birthright, but they're going about it the wrong way. And God sees that, and you see all the stipulations of the law that it's not directly said to you in the Bible, like Genesis 10, and and Ham broke this stipulation in Article 4, point I, and it doesn't. But once you understand the whole concept here and the bigger context, then you're recognizing, oh my gosh, this is what's happening, is that they're trying to usurp the throne. Why? Because they want the birthright. But these stipulations that are put in, I'm sorry to say this, but it wasn't hard to not follow. Like, hey, don't rape your mom. I mean, like, how hard is that? You know what I mean? So these things aren't like really hard, harsh things. It was just like the proper thing to do, as God is trying to establish a priesthood, a nation that would represent him and be a light for everyone else, so that they can come in and establish this righteous kingdom. That was the whole point of it all.
As we grow into this conversation too, we'll get into the more corporate and the bigger aspects that this is also talking about, which will bring more clarity to why these things happen. When we get into more of the symbolic usage of, Eve is actually very symbolic of the priesthood, just as Adam is symbolic as the priest. And so therefore we would see that same situation transfer over into these contexts, as Noah being the priest and his wife who got raped was the priesthood, which then actually brings us back to Genesis 3, where it wasn't Adam, but his wife who got misused by Satan. And here now we have a picture of Noah, whose wife gets misused by Satan, by an opposer. So all of a sudden that theme, that it's more Hebrewic themes as opposed to our trying to make it read something. So not to steal your thunder there,
Right.
Mercy. I just wanted to say there's also these bigger concepts that unfortunately, just due to time and detail, we can't get into in a first reading.
Yeah, that was great. That was a great mini lesson there. I loved it.
So before we go on to this, because the next conversation we're going to transition, because we'll see even the whole context now is shifting, and we're going to see what is the fallout. So just like we did in Genesis 3, we saw the fallout of Adam, And that's basically what we just read here in Genesis 9 was the fallout of Noah. So now in Genesis 4, we see a duplication of the fallout of the children of the descendants. Well, that's what we're going to read in the next episode as we get together into Genesis 10 and Genesis 11, as now Noah's descendants are going to fall, just as Adam, who was the head, fell. Well, we just watched Noah the head fall, and then we watched Noah's descendant, or Adam's descendants fall rather. And next, we're going to follow that same pattern with Noah's descendants breaking and falling. So I said a lot of the same words there. Hopefully that sounded clear.
That was good. You have the fallen ones, the Nephilim, the giant ones, the men of renown. This is not literal giants, folks, but it's people that should have been placed in heavenly places to have the authority to rule with God, to give them that dominion mandate, but they fell. They came out of that blessed position, went into cursed position, and now they are just the sons of men, right? This is the picture that we're getting here.
And we're going to see how, when we take a look at Babel, a lot of this exact same language starts popping up again. And it's very important for us to get into that. So now that we've seen this, I think hopefully we're starting to see. So again, quick transition. Genesis 1, creation of the head. Genesis 2, creation of the body. Genesis 3, the fall of the head. Genesis 4, the fall of the body. Genesis 5, a new head being promised. Genesis 6, we get this is what's going to happen to you judgment. Genesis 7, here's the judgment being played out. Genesis 8, a new beginning. Genesis 9, the new beginning's head is created and it falls. Genesis 10 is going to be the body is created, and Genesis 11 is going to be the body falls. Now, if you followed me through that whole explanation, I think you'll be just as excited for next week's talk, because not only does this pattern continue, but it hopefully is going to answer a lot more questions about why is Abraham so darn important? But Abraham's only important because of everything we're getting through. So hopefully you can see that too. Any last words, Mercy, before we shut her down? We're right up against it.
Yeah, no, that's great. I'm really excited to have this kind of talk of origins and really look into the text to see what is it really saying. And I think it's going to be eye-opening for many, many people. So thank you.
And just one more shout out for my channel, plug myself. If you're still confused about some of this language, please go through the verse by verse series. Also take a look at the book series where I go through a lot of language. What is life? What is death? What is sin? How should we approach these things and apply them to Genesis? What do these words in Genesis get used by? We saw in this conversation today, a lot of these words have a lot of impactful, assumed, understood meaning behind them. Like, to uncover your father's nakedness. Well, if we think that's talking like to uncover Noah's nakedness, if you think we're talking about Noah, that's why we need to do these studies. So please catch up, go watch verse by verse, check those other ones out. They'll help catch you up to the language and why we're saying the things we're saying. We're not just taking liberties. This has been established in the videos before, and we don't want to spend the time rehashing them because they're big. They're specifically detailed on purpose so that we can move into these conversations as, okay, now that we're getting a better chance, or we're getting a better understanding of how they're speaking, what are they actually then trying to say? And that hopefully becomes clear as we continue these talks. I'm gonna go a little cheesy here, talking our way through origins. I couldn't get it. I had it, but I lost the name of our video there. Sorry. Anyway, I want to thank you guys all for making it to the end. Next time, we'll just continue on where we left off. And if you have questions, please throw them into the comments. And again, go to the very first video, I think it is on here for Discord, if you want to be part of the conversations all week long. Love to have you on there. And otherwise, wherever you are, hope this finds you well, and God bless.